Hi, I'm Lisa Savage, candidate for U.S. Senate. Thanks for connecting with me to hear a discussion about the costs of war today. I'm very pleased to be here with you all. Thank you for taking the time to do this. I'm going to introduce our moderator for this evening, Tamara Hunt. Tamara is a student intern with our campaign, and she is a graduate student at the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine. She moderated perhaps a candidate panel that you saw, a forum that you saw earlier this year that I participated in, and she did such a great job. She's going to be our moderator for this webinar. So thanks everyone for participating, and I'm going to hand off to Tamara.
Thanks, Lisa. Good evening, everyone. And like she said, my name is Tamara Hunt. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and on behalf of the Lisa for Maine campaign, I'm honored to welcome you and our panelists to the first webinar in our The Way Forward series. Today, our webinar is going to focus on the cost of war, and I just want to say thank you all for joining us. This evening, you, the audience, through a survey feature on Zoom, and our three panelists will be answering 3 questions related to the cost of war. I will put on the screen a slide with information for you to use to help answer a proposed multiple choice question that will pop up. Then each panelist will have the opportunity to provide their expert opinion in regards to the question topic. In the interest of time, each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes, and then the same survey question will pop up again for you to confirm your answer or change it based on the information shared by the panelists. So if you see me making hand signals during their speaking time, it's because I will be giving signals when 10 seconds remain. That will look like this, and if panelists go over 10 seconds, it'll look like this. All question topics and agenda were provided to the panelists in advance. There will be a brief Q&A discussion session available towards the end of our time together. So feel free to submit your questions at any time during the event in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any tech issues or concerns, please direct them to us in the chat box. If you do submit a question, please list your name, how to pronounce it, and who the question is intended for. And that can be for one panelist or all of them. We should wrap up around 6:30, but before we begin, I have the pleasure of introducing each of our panelists. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who was a foreign correspondent for 15 years for the New York Times, where he served as a Middle East bureau chief and Balkan bureau chief for the paper. He previously worked overseas for the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR. He has also authored 12 books and has taught at Columbia University, New York University, Princeton University, the University of Toronto, as well as the BA program run by Rutgers University in the New Jersey prison system. Our second guest is Bruce Gagnon. He is the chair of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power. He was an early member of the anti-defense lobby in the 1970s regarding the U.S. space program. Today, he's the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons, Nuclear Power, and Space. He was a co-founder of the Global Network when it was created in 1992. He's also an active member of the Veterans for Peace and is Secretary of Space in the Green Shadow Cabinet. Bruce published a new version of his book in 2008 called Come Together Right Now, Organizing Stories from a Fading Empire. He also has a blog called Organizing Notes and has written articles that have appeared in publications like Asia Times, Counterpunch, and Z Magazine. And finally, we have Lisa Savage. She is a teacher, organizer, and grandmother from Solon, Maine, who has spent decades fighting for people, planet, and peace. She's been a small business owner, served as a union negotiator, and is running as an independent Green to give Mainers a senator who will work for the people, not the powerful. She is the only remaining candidate in Maine's ranked choice voting Senate race who stands for Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, free public higher education, and ending all endless wars. As your voice in the Senate, Lisa will do what it takes to protect our children's future and create a better world for all of us. Thank you to our audience and panelists for your willingness to participate in this event and share with us your unique insights. So we're going to begin with our first question of the night. And before we get into that, I'm going to go ahead and put up a slide that's going to have some information that you can base your answer on for a survey question that will pop up. So I'll give you just a few seconds to look that over. And while you look that over, the survey question that we're going to begin the evening with is the US has 800 plus military bases in other countries. Do you think this is too many, just right, not enough, or other? So go ahead and provide your answer in the pop-up box for us to review later. And now I'd like to turn to our panelists and ask, why does the US have 800 plus bases in other countries? All right, we'll wait just a moment while everyone's answers come in. And I was wondering, Chris, would you like to start us off? And at any point in time, if any of the panelists would like me to repeat the question, I'm happy to do so.
Well, it's the nature of empire. All empires have the characteristic of constant expansion beyond their capacity to sustain themselves, which is the point that we've reached. The late stage of empire sees it engage in what historians call micro-militarism. That means that they overreach. They carry out military adventures that essentially destroy the capacity of empire to sustain itself. So, for instance, in the Greek Empire, if you read Thucydides, it's when they attacked Sicily and the Greek fleet was sunk and all the soldiers, most of the Greek soldiers were slaughtered. You saw it in 56 when Britain attempted to retake the Suez after Nasser nationalized and had to retreat in humiliation. And this is what we've done in the Middle East. Now almost 2 decades of war. We've lost the war in Afghanistan. I think you could argue we lost the war in Iraq. It's a Shiite-dominated government with close ties to Tehran. We've created one failed state after another in Libya, Syria, and squandered anywhere between $5 and $7 trillion, not to mention the human cost, millions of people displaced, hundreds of thousands of people killed. Empires, they become so large, and this is, again, is a characteristic of all empires, that political leaders or civilians can no longer control it. We don't even audit the Pentagon budget. They get more money than they want, whether that's from Democrats or Republicans. And this siphoning off of resources to a massive military program. Look at the late Roman Empire, where they had 1 million members in the Roman army that they couldn't sustain. You end up hollowing the country out from the inside. That's why our bridges and infrastructure is crumbling. It's why half the country lives in poverty or near poverty. Just to close, what happens is that you create social unrest or the potential for social unrest, and you bring back the tools of empire. So that's militarized police, wholesale surveillance, drones. When Thucydides said that the tyranny Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. And so we have all of the characteristics of late empire, and the military is key. You lose control of the military. Officially we spend half of all discretionary spending on the military, but that's in fact not correct, because there are all sorts of other programs, veterans affairs, nuclear programs, which are military, in essence, adjuncts of the military industrial complex that aren't even counted. So any student of empire will tell you that the late stage of empire sees a military which essentially it overextends itself and dominates so many of the resources of the state that it falls in on itself. It's why Alexander Berkman called the military the enemy within.
Thank you, Chris. Bruce, would you like to comment?
Bruce, you need to unmute.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Air Force, and we lived all over the United States and also in England and Germany. And my first real thinking about the US military empire that Chris just described was in Wiesbaden, Germany, where my dad was stationed. I began seeing signs of "Go Home Yankee," and we lived downtown and our tires were slashed. And it began to slowly dawn on me that we were not particularly welcome. Throughout the years, I visited many bases, US bases around the world in my peace work. And there's a real cultural imperialism that comes with the US bases as they're developed around the world. Bars, prostitution, murders. Not too long ago, we were in Okinawa, and there were countless stories of drunken US GIs driving their cars, crashing them into civilians, killing them, murders of women, rapes by US GIs. So the whole power dynamic that comes with those bases really takes hold on the people in those communities, as well as the environmental impacts. They're quite huge as well. So what is the real purpose of these bases? And of course, it's the US military boot on the neck of people in that particular region, so the US can control markets and resources, and also the shipping lanes in a particular place, such the reason for the US bases in the Asia Pacific today, where we see the US challenging China's use of the South China Sea. How about that as a coincidence, right? And of course, corporate profits are enormous when you think about how much money is spent on the US bases around the world. And in a way, it's a jobs program too, by supplying all the troops to all these bases around the world. Many working class kids that are then employed and put into this role of being an occupation soldier. So clearly, there must be a stronger recognition in this country that people all over the world do not want us with their bases in their country. They're protesting continually, trying to get us out of there. But the American people are really not at all aware. Of course, the corporate media is not going to tell us the stories about the people in these communities, but we all have a greater responsibility to give voice to people around the world who are organizing to get our bases out of their country.
Thanks for sharing that with us, Bruce. Lisa, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Tamara, and thanks, Chris and Bruce, for giving us some thoughts to chew on. I think there are two basic reasons that I would cite for the reason that we have more than 800 military outposts around the planet. Bruce alluded to one of them, and Chris alluded to one of them. I think, first of all, I would say capitalism, because the profit motive in all of the military adventures, the weapon systems that are very, very expensive and very profitable for people that are already super wealthy, they need to be used. If you're building them, then they've got to go somewhere. And I do believe that, at the end of World War II, the US had the opportunity to sort of declare victory, gather in the scientists that had worked for both the Japanese Empire and the Nazis, and kind of fold them into the US war machine, the think tanks that inform that project, and then go on to put out this image of the US as the land of freedom and the purveyor of democracy around the planet. But to do so by occupying other people's countries with military bases is, contrary to what's being said and what's being done do not really match up. Bruce alluded to the fact that most people in the US do not really have the information to question this. they don't really know how many military bases are around the planet. Most people are shocked when they find out the actual number. That map that we looked at made a distinction between bases, which are like a permanent installation, such as Okinawa has had since World War II continuously, or lily pads, meaning more temporary forward outposts of military. And you could see that there were quite a few of those on the map as well. Again, I'm not sure that most Americans are aware that AFRICOM is in the African continent establishing those temporary military bases in many, many parts, many nations in Africa. And I'm not sure that, that people in the US know that very clearly. So information control has been super important for this phase of empire, even though we have a glut of information and could theoretically find any information that we were interested in by going on the internet or listening to some informed friends or perhaps consulting a research librarian. Most people are pretty focused on the feed of infotainment and controversies and political posturing and performance, rather than making their own decisions about, wait, is that information I really need, or is there some information that would be more useful to me? The other thing that we're going to look at in a minute, of course, is the cost of all this, and both of you, Chris and Bruce, alluded to that as well. Most people, well, I've just retired from being a school teacher in rural Maine, and the families of the students that I worked with are mostly struggling to keep a roof over their head and food on the table. I was paying I've been paying a 30% income tax rate on my school teacher salary. My husband's a self-employed woodworker, and that's been pretty consistent. And when people are paying that kind of tax rate, I don't think that the corporations who are making money on weapon systems and the corporations that control our mass media are often the same corporations, and they don't really want the US taxpayer to really know where those dollars go. So there's this narrative about, well, 9/11 happened and the US was attacked and we were vulnerable. And we had to, engage in the war on terror ever since to make ourselves safe from terror. So it's expanded now, even, from the Middle East into Africa. Well, terrorism has risen significantly since AFRICOM began military operations in Africa. So the war on terror has been an abysmal failure in terms of, has it reduced terror or has it increased terror? But I noticed that most of the young people that I've worked with over the years as a teacher often were reluctant to question that narrative. They perceived any criticism of this military empire project as being unpatriotic. And I know that at least Bruce and I would disagree strongly and say, in fact, criticizing it is one of the more patriotic things that you could do, because to watch so many people slipping deeper and deeper into poverty, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed really serious income inequality, healthcare access inequality, housing inequality, food insecurity. That was already in place, and the pandemic had made it much worse very, very quickly. But those are functions of the fact that we spend so much of our national treasury on weapon systems and outposts and this imperial project. So I do think that the narrative really needs to be questioned, and really we need to give people a chance to think out of that box of, oh, we're always scared, we're always vulnerable, we may be targeted, and to really take a look. I was a history major, and that helped me quite a lot. Chris made some great references to classical history in the Mediterranean region, and we can see some of those same patterns. I think that it really helps to question what the mass media is telling us about the military. Anytime I would do any counter recruiting work as a high school teacher, I taught high school for several years, if I shared with my advisory group some counter recruitment materials, someone would always challenge, sometimes students, but oftentimes the administration of the school would say, well, aren't you going to present the other side, or is this going to be a one-sided thing? And I would say, do you know how many ads for recruiting these kids to enlist in the military they've seen? You know, I would say to students, how many military recruitment ads do you see? And they'd go, well, if I watch MTV, there's like one every minute. So, you know, I would often say, well, okay, I'm going to show them one video of the other side at this point. So information control is insidious. It's almost like, you know, the goldfish can't perceive the water because they're always in it. And I think that we can't perceive the information control here in the heart of Empire because we're always in it. But I think that that's key to making some better decisions going forward.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa, for kind of giving us a better idea of the profit motive and information control that happens as a result of what Chris talked about, of the late stages of the empire, and kind of provide some historical context to this discussion. And Bruce, thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences and stories of people that you've had relationships with at all of these various bases from across the world. So thank you so much. And I appreciate all the comments coming in from the audience too. They're super interesting and helpful. So keep it up. For now, what we're going to do is go back to that same survey question that we all answered a few minutes ago. So go ahead and take a quick look at that and provide us with your answer. Based on all the information you just received from Chris, Bruce, and Lisa, has your opinion changed at all, or has it stayed the same? All right. And then once you're finished with that, we're going to move on to our second survey question of the evening. Again, I'm going to put up a slide with some more information for you to use. Here's the US spending on military alongside other countries. Based on what you see here, do you think it's too much, is just right, not enough, or maybe something else? So go ahead and look at that. And then we'll have that survey question pop up on your screen. And while you're looking at that, I'm going to direct a question to the panelists. How has the US military spending climbed so high? And was it the right amount? What do we need to do to change that? Or why should we maintain the status quo? And I think we're going to start off with Bruce. So go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay. I joined the Air Force in 1971 myself during the Vietnam War. I didn't go to Vietnam, but I was stationed at an airlift base in California that was a airlift base for the war. GIs would come to our base, Travis Air Force Base in California. They would come there to get on the plane to go to Vietnam, and when the planes would return, they would bring the body bags of the dead soldiers and the walking wounded. Having grown up in the military and being a young Republican for Nixon in 1968, when I joined the Air Force, actually I flunked my induction physical. So I had to get a waiver to get into the military when most people my age were trying to stay out. But being at this base in California really changed my life. My first roommate was one of the organizers in the GI resistance movement. And so we would have meetings in my room at night, and that's where my real transition to the peace movement happened. And when I got out in 1974, I was going to a community college in Orlando, Florida, and Jimmy Carter came to speak there. He was running for president. It was early on before the election, but I had my first introduction to him, and I'll never forget a phrase he used in his campaign. He said the arms race was a disgrace to the human race, and he was against nuclear weapons. And so I was very excited, and I began to work on his campaign as a volunteer. Soon after he was elected president, he began building the Kings Bay nuclear submarine base in St. Mary's, Georgia, which is in southern Georgia, right on the border with Florida. And this became a massive, massive base. Recently, there was a plowshares action there. People are now being sentenced for their particular action at that base. I went to many protests over many years when I lived in Florida at this particular base. So by the time Jimmy Carter was running for re-election, he doubled military spending. He was running against Ronald Reagan. He was afraid of being called weak on communism. And so he doubled military spending at that time. And it was what really began my overall transition away from the Democratic Party, believing in it, seeing any real hope or solution for this continual war budget that we have. That graphic you put up there had about a $700 billion military budget. It's really about $1 trillion a year now when you add up all the money from like nuclear weapons spending is in the Department of Energy budget, and some of the military satellites are in separate budgets. So it's about $1 trillion a year that is being spent today. And it's no coincidence that we don't have any damn money for anything else in this country. So I urge everyone to never call it the defense budget ever again, because it's really an offense budget. It's all about a U.S. projecting power and control and domination around the world, and now also into space with the creation of this new military branch of the service called the Space Force. We're going to see space become a real offensive platform. They're going to tell us it's about defending everyone and making sure we can have freedom of space, just like we talk about freedom of navigation of the oceans. But it's really about control and domination of space and projecting power from space through space and also onto the Earth below. So Russia and China are continually demonized, but when you look at how much money they spend on the military, it's a fraction of what the United States is spending. So it's really outrageous that the United States is spending so much. If we really wanted to have a defensive military, something they talk about all the time, they say the warships made at Bath Iron Works nearby where I live now. They say that those ships are being built to defend America. Well, those are offensive power projection weapon systems on board of those ships, and they're parking them off the coast of China and Russia, encircling both of those countries, provoking them, escalating tensions, creating more dangerous world, creating the possibility of a nuclear Armageddon, literally. So we can't for a moment believe that this stuff is defensive. But if we really wanted a defensive budget, we could probably get away with spending $200 billion or even less protecting the country. But who's going to really invade us anyway? We have two oceans. We have peaceful neighbors on both the north and south. Anyway, it's really outrageous what we're doing today and the kind of money that we're wasting, just literally pissing down the rat hole. And I'm really glad Lisa is starting out this series on this particular issue. I think it's so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Lisa, would you like to comment?
Sure. Well, I think that some of the, historically, the budget used to fund wars as a separate item. Do you remember the old war supplemental back in the Obama administration? In fact, as soon as Senator Obama received the nomination of the Democratic Party for president, he went back to the Senate, and one of his first votes was to approve that year's war supplemental. That again was bad optics, and information control suggested that, oh, let's fold the war into the Pentagon base budget. So that made the number get quite a bit higher. And it's now called the, I believe, Overseas Contingency Fund is what we now call what used to be called the war supplemental. It has indeed grown by leaps and bounds in our lifetime. And one of the things that I think we tend not to see is the profit motive there, because again, the narrative is, oh, well, there are terrorists, there are countries that don't wish us well, and we need to have this, really strong military to protect us. But much of that bar that we saw of the, Bruce is saying more truthfully, $1 trillion are profits for companies such as General Dynamics, which owns Bath Iron Works. They are so wealthy that back in the Occupy movement, the 1% were, that was a way of describing the super wealthy people among us. Weapons manufacturers were described as the 0.01% of the 1%. That's how super, super wealthy they are. And there's a revolving door between government and the private sector that makes these profits. So you go from being on the, a military brass or someone in the executive branch of government that does military contracting decisions, and then you go back and you go on the board of General Dynamics or Lockheed or Boeing or one of those type of companies. So the private people in government now tend to like to describe it as a public-private partnership whenever these kind of projects come up. The definition of fascism is when business interests run your government, and the Nazi Germany was very harshly criticized for that. And I lived in Japan many years ago as a young mother, and the Japanese citizens there didn't know what Pearl Harbor Day was at all, but they knew what Hiroshima Day was. And when asked to describe how did your country go down that path, they almost all would say some version of, well, it was the big business cartels that forced our government to wage that war. The people didn't want the war. In fact, the people were really experiencing food shortages and a lot of deprivation during the end of the Japanese Empire and during World War II. So we're kind of seeing that happen again here, where little children go to bed hungry, but the CEO of one of these corporations that takes so much of our tax dollars are so fabulously wealthy. They make tens of millions of dollars annually for their role in overseeing a weapons manufacturing. So I think that there's, I guess this is a long-winded way of saying, I think there's a lot of fluff in those numbers that doesn't need to be there, that you could in fact probably have, like Bruce said, a pretty effective military force to actually defend the US if it didn't include lots of bonuses and yachts for people that were formerly working for the Pentagon and now they work for private corporations. That's been a very bad system for the actual people in any empire where it happened. I also wanted to, I noticed that Chris pointed out and Bruce pointed out that that figure is somewhat false, because nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons development is quite expensive, but it's always been carried in the energy department budget, so you don't really see it. And then the other thing that I'd like to touch on before my time is up is the Veterans Administration has its own budget line. So when we see that bar graph, it doesn't include care for veterans that have served. And I am not in any way suggesting that we should underfund the VA. I think the VA provides a lot of great socialized health care that many veterans that I know are very pleased with. At least here in Maine, they love their VA. And it also subsidizes education for many people that have served. So I don't want to defund the VA, but if we're really adding up the price tag of America's military project, you really need to include nuclear weapons, and you need to include the costs after people have left active service to get a true picture of exactly how much we are spending.
Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate it. Chris, would you like to go next?
Sure. I mean, after World War I, we had already, in World War I, we reconfigured industrial production, primarily to support France and Britain in the war industry. That's why Wilson was under such tremendous pressure to enter the war after the Russian Revolution, because the Kaiser could transfer 51 divisions from the Russian front back to the Western front and potentially win the war. And the banks, which had provided the loans to France and Britain, knew they wouldn't be paid back. But after World War I, those domestic industries that had worked for the war industry went back to domestic production. That didn't happen after World War II. In the name of the Cold War, we kept producing weapons at the same level that we had produced them. And in order to justify the production of those weapons, you needed the constant bombardment of anti-communist propaganda, the Red Menace, and that's what got us into trouble. So, if you're a factory that makes industrial equipment, you're far better off working for the war industry, because you're not only guaranteed, you are guaranteed a profit, you're even guaranteed your cost overruns. So the great economist at Columbia University, Seymour Melman, wrote books on this and talked about how this essentially had shattered the health of the American economy, so that when New York City wanted to order subway cars, there's no factory in the United States that makes subway cars. They had to order from Japan. And so that, military production distorted, deformed, and largely destroyed the economic health of the country. And of course, what they did is spread, quite astutely, spread military production in all of the states. And that's where you get both parties, including the Democratic Party, even Bernie Sanders, talking about how it provides jobs. So, they have the aircraft factory in Burlington. And so essentially you created a military industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned against, that both militarily, but also economically is beyond control, and is consuming larger and larger sums. And the figures are quite, I think that second highest expenditures on the military is China. And I think if I have it right, it's 25 billion, roughly around there, whereas we're spending at least $1 trillion yearly. Officially, we're spending 730 something billion. So again, it was a kind of monster that grew and is no longer something that we can control. And it's not only destroying the nature of the fabric of the country itself, but has already, I would argue, destroyed it economically. And that is, I think if I remember correctly, the CEO, the head of Raytheon, Thomas Kennedy, I think his name, is paid $17 million a year in compensation. And then, of course, it's the old revolving door. So as soon as you get out of the military, you sit on these boards, or, if you're a general. If you're not a general and you're a retired colonel, you're hired either to do sales or so. And many of these people who, including the current head of the Pentagon, who comes out of Boeing, there's that cross-pollination between both the weapons manufacturers and those who procure the weapons and buy them on behalf of the government. Whether you need them or not is irrelevant. So again, it's about, and that is a characteristic of late empire, it's a military which has become unaccountable and untouchable, and is a deeply destructive force, not only to the democracy, but to the economy as well.
Thank you so much. And thank you for those historical and current day examples of how the US military is exploitive, offensive rather than defensive, and excessive in nature. So taking all that information that you just received, again, we're going to pull up that same survey question in comparison to other countries. Is the US spending on the military too much, not enough, just right, or other? So I'll give you just a moment to fill that out. All right. And then our final survey question is on the topic of climate change and war. I saw some people have already commented on that in our chat box. So here's some research on emissions produced by US wars since 2001. And while you're reading that over, do you think emissions from US wars, are they necessary? Could they be reduced significantly? Are they insignificant in the larger scheme of things, or maybe something else? So we'll go ahead and put up that survey question that'll pop up on your screen. There it is. And then I'm going to direct the question to our panelists. What is the military's role in driving climate change? And this time we'll start with Lisa. Would you like to begin the discussion? We can't hear you. Or do you still need a few minutes?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute while the survey was on the screen. It didn't give me the unmute button. Thank you, Tamara, for that question. This is something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about and reading research and studying about in the last several years. It became clear to me that the young people that were activists, that were concerned about their futures, were very focused on climate crisis, and rightly so. And I began to really try to dig out information about what the role of the military was in driving climate crisis. Nobody was talking about it. It was hard to find information back a few years ago when I started trying to do this. And one of the reasons for that, I believe, is that the big international climate conference that was held in Kyoto that developed the Kyoto protocols, setting targets for reducing emissions, was pressured very hard by the United States to not include military emissions. And I always jokingly think of this like, because the Earth's atmosphere is so patriotic that it doesn't really care if the emissions come out of the Pentagon. It only, it drives climate change no matter who's emitting. But it was very effective. And incidentally, the US never signed the Kyoto protocols, but getting that exclusion was very effective in controlling what people knew and how they thought about what was driving climate crisis. So we would be admonished to get a hybrid car or, heat our houses in a different way. And those are all good things that we need to do. And we also need to stop flying in airplanes so much because it's very bad for the climate. And the climate crisis has deepened and accelerated in the last few years, alarmingly. But military aircraft are actually more polluting than commercial aircraft. In most cases, the type of fuel that military jets use emits more greenhouse gases and more dangerous ones. And obviously it doesn't, it's not too hard to think about what might be the effect of blowing things up or setting an oil refinery in Iraq or Kuwait on fire. We can just, through the pictures, see the visual evidence of, gee, that must be really putting a lot of pollutions into the air. So it's been interesting to follow the work of scholars. Anita Crawford at Brown University has done a lot of work. They have the Cost of War project there, where they quantify different types of costs, not just climate. But I heard her speak in Portland about a year ago. It was very interesting because she said when she began that research, she really couldn't find any information from the Pentagon or the government really telling what emissions were. She wasn't quite sure if they weren't counting them or they just wouldn't reveal the data. But so she began to extrapolate from their use of fossil fuels, figuring, well, I can run some algorithms that tell you if you're using this much petroleum, how much emissions are you probably getting from that, depending on what you're doing with the petroleum. And so that infographic that we just looked at was based on her research. And she decided not to look at the Pentagon as a whole or the military as a whole. She really wanted to know the war on terror. What has been the climate cost of the war on terror? So she started at 01 with the events of 9/11 and brought it forward. Since that time, the next time that there was a big climate conference in Paris, the movement to exclude counting the military had eroded a little bit. And so in the Paris Accords, it became optional to count your military's emissions when, giving what your national footprint is and gauging whether you're going to meet your goal or you're not going to meet your goal, or even setting the goals, what would be reasonable. So I started a group called the Maine Natural Guard. And it was basically a campaign asking people to take a pledge, and many people have, and I'm sure many of the people on this webinar have taken the pledge. It's a very simple pledge. It is to connect the dots between the Pentagon and climate harm. And so if people are talking about the military, to bring up the fact that the military has a huge role in driving the climate crisis because of their emissions. And then if people are talking about security, to bring up the fact that really climate crisis is the biggest security threat to life on the planet. The pandemic has kind of loomed up in our faces very large at this point in history, but climate crisis is disrupting so many life systems on the planet, and we're not exactly sure how quickly it's going to change. It's an unprecedented a threat that scientists only understand part of. It's a very complicated system with many, inputs. So, but to bring up, if you're talking about security, shouldn't you be talking about climate? One of the things that's interesting, and you might try it if you're interested at home, is Google Pentagon and climate crisis, or Pentagon and climate change, or military and climate change. And what you will get is the public relations writing that the Pentagon puts out about they realize that climate crisis is a big threat to their operations. So many of those military bases are right at the edge of the ocean. So sea level rise is going to be very significant. And they will tell how they're greening the Navy or something like that, or, oh, we've gone solar, but they never address the elephant in the room, which is their greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, Chris, you're up next. Hey, Chris, we can't hear you. That mute button.
There you go. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so the military is the federal government's largest consumer of fossil fuel, about 80%. It is the world's single largest consumer of oil. Just for instance, the B-2 stealth bomber, which holds about 25,000 gallons of jet fuel, it burns at about 4 gallons per mile and emits more than 250 metric tons of greenhouse gases over a 6,000 nautical mile range. So the military has been quite adamant that its contribution towards global warming, which is massive, is not counted or measured, and that's because it knows that it is certainly within the rubric of the U.S. government the largest contributor to global emissions. And yeah, Lisa's right. I mean, the greatest existential crisis facing human society is global warming. And the Pentagon, which is at least good about running scenarios on the future, knows very well that numerous bases already are experiencing sea level rise. And I think if I have it right, about a third of US bases are potentially going to be affected by sea level rise. So all the way around, it is that kind of feedback loop where on the one hand you have the military contributing significantly to global warming and also damaging its very own infrastructure in the process. So yeah, I mean, aside from all of the reasons that we shouldn't have a military, we should cut the military budget by at least 75%. You also have this added factor that it is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases.
Thank you, Chris. And you can go ahead, Bruce. Thank you.
Okay. Well, earlier we were talking about the 800 bases that the US has, more than 800. So just imagine for a moment, just think about all the energy and all the pollution and all the carbon boot print that those bases have combined. It's just incredible. The first thing that comes to my mind is Trump's recent military flyovers to honor the special people during this virus pandemic. Not only a waste of money, but a massive, again, addition to this problem. But war games around the world, I think, have to be really looked at. Right now, the U.S. and some of its allies are moving this RIMPAC, R-I-M-P-A-C, RIMPAC war game into motion that's going to be aimed at particularly China, but also Russia as well, because, Russia borders North Korea. So, it's right in that region too, the Asia Pacific region. And so this RIMPAC war game, it's mostly Navy, but it's other branches as well. It's going to have massive, massive carbon boot print. And then constantly the U.S. is wargaming surrounding both Russia and China, with war games going on aimed at North Korea all the time. And then also the war games that are going on in Poland, Norway, the Baltics, aimed at Russia. And in fact, at these war games, the United States now ships, and imagine this process, putting all kinds of tanks, armored personnel carriers, all kinds of military hardware on ships, sending it to Germany. They unload it there. They drive it all the way into Poland for the war games. And then they leave it at a base there in Poland that's become a major weapons hub as the U.S. encircles Russia. So just imagine the carbon disaster that all those create. And then also hundreds of space launches, launching military satellites, and now we're seeing Elon Musk and other billionaires, Jeff Bezos getting into launching, and they're launching all these satellites. Every one of these launches punches a hole in the ozone layer. I remember when I lived in Florida, and every time there was a launch, there would be a report that at Cape Canaveral, the launch facility there at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station is surrounded. They like to brag about it. It's surrounded by this beautiful nature preserve to kind of give cover, that what they're doing is, benign. But in fact, every time there was a launch, there would be fish and bird kills at this beautiful wildlife preserve there because of the pollution that comes down from the rocket exhaust and then lands in the water and the swamp, and then the fish die and the birds eat the fish, and just it goes on and on and on. And today what we see with climate change, and to me it's really disgusting, is how the Democrats are using the issue to ride back into power. And it reminds me of when Obama first ran the first time. He rode the anti-war horse. He jumped on that horse and he rode it into the White House. And people were tired of the Iraq War, George W. Bush's shock and awe. They were tired of Afghanistan. There was a strong anti-war sentiment out there. And Obama rode that horse into the White House, but then he locked it in a barn. And he took the key and he threw it in the Potomac River and then continued on with the war machine. Well, that's exactly what the Democrats are poised to do today, is jump on the climate crisis horse, ride it into the White House, and then do very little. Because why? They're controlled by this corporate money, this corporate agenda, that, you know, this growth agenda that is all about consumption and creating more of this pollution. What we really need is a real Green New Deal, something the Democrats are not supporting, and we need conversion of the military-industrial complex, and we need it now, today. So at a place like Bath Iron Works here in Maine, we could be building a commuter rail system up and down the coast of Maine. When tourists come here, they could get out of their cars, not even need their cars, and be taken all over the state. You know, the old timers talk about at one time years ago in Maine, you could catch a train to any part of the state. Well, those days are over. We're stuck in our cars. So why can't we be building a commuter rail system at Bath Iron Works? Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you everyone else for sharing how our U.S. military is misidentifying the threat. And Bruce, for providing some hopeful solutions that hopefully our society will learn to accept over the next couple of years. So right now what we're going to do is go back to that third survey question and answer it again. There it is. So if you could provide us with your response once more. And then I'm just going to mention really quick, each of those slides presented before each of the survey questions, we're going to have those available to you in addition to a recording of this event. All right. And then before we go into our Q&A discussion time, it looks like we've got about a half hour left. We're going to review some of the survey question results and see if anyone changed their mind in the process of this dialogue. So here's the first one. Looks like we had 34 people participate. And then let's see if anyone changed their mind. There we are. Well, it looks like we had more people participate in the second poll, so that changed the look of it a little bit. And to any of the panelists, if you want to comment, please feel free to do so. All right, we can go on to the next one.
I would be interested to know what other, several people had marked other, and I'm always interested to know what answers they had that were kind of out of the box. Maybe we can do that in the Q&A.
Yes, that's my hope. All right, we'll see if it changed. The second survey question changed. Guess not. Everyone was too well informed. All right, so this is the third survey. We've got one person who thought it was necessary. One thought it was insignificant. We've got two who have a different opinion, and then 43 people could be reduced significantly. Right. We'll go to see second round of results. A little bit different. All right. Any comments on the survey results? Nope. All right. Now we can begin our question and answer portion of the event. Our first question, let's see. All right. Unless I don't hear anything from Chris.
Oh, are you, sorry, I sent them in the chat. Did you get them?
I didn't know.
Need me to ask them? Or,
Yeah, if you'd like to, that works as well.
let me try one more time, see if you get some of them. Well, the first one I'll just ask, and then I'll try to send the other ones via chat again. This one was submitted from Kim Rich and can be assigned to any of our panelists. Have there been any US bills introduced to shut down any of our global military bases that lie at or below sea level? The second part would be, are there any plans to shut down military bases that are deemed in harm's way of tornadoes, hurricanes, or rising sea levels? So essentially any plans or specific bills introduced to address this issue of the military bases that are going to be impacted by climate change. And yeah, Chris, do you want to take a shot at that question?
Sorry, the naval station in Norfolk, which is home to the Atlantic Fleet, because it's already experiencing flooding. I think it's a couple times a month. The seawater subsumes the steam lines that run along the piers where the ships are moored. It comes up through the drains. So there's a clear understanding by the Navy that certainly over the long term, it's not going to be sustainable. I mean, the whole city's under siege from increasing sea levels. But this is, rising sea levels are threatening hundreds of other US bases around the world. But I know in Norfolk, they can't even enter when the tides come in. They have to close bridges on certain days. So it's already being pretty severely affected, and it's only going to get a lot worse. So I don't see how, for instance, a few decades ago, that naval base is going to exist.
I haven't heard of any bills or anyone talk about really closing anything. As Chris was talking about Norfolk, I've just heard that the Navy is saying we need $200 billion to retrofit to kind of, I guess, raise the piers, at the Norfolk shipyard. I just learned the other day from a BIW worker that the data center at BIW floods routinely. But recently they had a big flood, and a lot of their whole computer system at the whole shipyard shut down for a period of time because, and I guess the data center is very close to the river. So anyway, I'm just sure that this is a problem at so many places that we never hear about. And when you just start putting your head around how much is it going to cost to, deal with all of this over time, the Pentagon's going to be coming in begging for more and more money that we can't even imagine, if they want to keep this empire going. So the American people really need to get on the ball on this issue, because there's just not going to be any money for anything. They're going to soak up every damn penny they can to deal with this stuff. And this is why it's so important to be making this link between the Pentagon and climate change, because the Republicans and the Democrats aren't going to go near it. And in this particular race that Lisa's in, Sarah Gideon's not going to talk about this for a second. Forget about it. Her big corporate donors would never allow it for her to talk about it.
Thanks, Bruce. Lisa, would you like to comment, or should we move on to the next question? Okay.
Well, let's go on to the next question. I think they did a good job. Thanks.
Okay. So this question is from Lizzie Adams for Bruce. Toby Ord in his book, The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity estimates the catastrophic risk of nuclear war within the next 100 years to be 1 in 1,000. What is the best way forward to reducing and eliminating this risk to humanity?
Well, the only way that we could, well, there's two ways we could have a nuclear war. One is accidental. And for example, the US has deployed it's called Aegis Ashore. You know, at Bath Iron Works, they build Aegis destroyers that are outfitted with so-called missile defense systems. And those same launch pads on those destroyers can also launch cruise missiles, first strike attack cruise missiles. And the US has now built a Aegis Ashore, they call it Aegis Ashore launch facility. So it took the stuff, the launch pads off the ships and are putting them on land. They put them in Romania, and now they're going into Poland. And they will be able to fire a first strike attack cruise missile, nuclear capable, could carry nuclear warheads, from Poland or Romania that would reach Moscow in just a couple minutes. And so when you're facing this kind of encirclement of Russia and China by the US military, you're essentially forcing the Russians to put everything on launch on warning status, which means the slightest accident could create nuclear war. And so I think that's the answer, is pull back. Stop this military encirclement of Russia and China, this aggressive, steroidal military encirclement of both those countries. That's the way out. Pull it back.
Great answer. Thank you. All right. And then this one is from Heidi. And this one's for Lisa. If we pull our bases out, where would your budgetary priorities be to put those important resources?
Thank you for that question. I think budgets are a moral document, or moral documents, and I think that taking care of people is my top priority. Medicare for all, an expanded, improved Medicare for all that was truly universal, every resident of the US receiving comprehensive medical care, you know, including dental, including vision, including mental health, including you know, substance abuse counseling and harm reduction. So medical care has been increasingly only for the people that are pretty well off. It's dreadfully unequal. And now that we have the coronavirus, this novel coronavirus spreading throughout the country, people in the US, I think, are starting to understand how powerful it is when a nation has a universal national healthcare system to guide the population through something unprecedented like this, and to make sure, you know, healthcare has tended to be viewed in the US as something like, if you don't have it, there must be something wrong with you. You didn't work hard enough. You didn't go to school long enough. You didn't. But as we all know, there are many, many people that are working very hard and did go to school and don't have adequate health care in this country. Well, once you're in a pandemic situation, you know, your health care is only as good as the health care of the least well cared for person in your community, because that's the nature of public health and epidemiology. So healthcare is first and foremost where I would start to fix some of the very serious problems that we've incurred here. Education is always way up at the top of my list. I'm just coming off 25 years of teaching in the public schools, and I think that public education has been underfunded my entire lifetime. And I also feel strongly that student debt should be abolished. Young people are not able to get on with their lives, and that's unfair. And my generation had some student debt that was, you know, manageable. Young people today coming out of a state university are saddled with 5 or 6 figures worth of student debt that they signed on to as teenagers often. And and if they declare bankruptcy, they can't get out from under it. That is a bad system for people. It's not taking care of people. And it's also a bad system for the economic exchanges that would go on. People would build houses, people would start new ventures, people would have a family if they were freed from that debt burden. Also, other wealthy countries see the value of educating the people, the young people in their community that want to become engineers or doctors or teachers or researchers. In other wealthy countries, or even countries not nearly as wealthy as the US, if you do well in school and you want to go to medical school, that's on the taxpayer, because obviously it benefits the taxpayers to have well-educated health professionals. So that's another area that I think is really important for our budget priorities. I mentioned the Veterans Administration earlier. I do think that caring for veterans is important. It's certainly very important in Maine. Maine has a high percentage of veterans in the population, and also it's a rather on average elder population that requires more health care. So I would start with those things and then see how much of our resources did that take, and then what's left. You know, we all have family budgets where we say, here's how much we have to work with, here's what our priorities are, let's decide. Where I've done many penny polls in Maine where you give people 10 pennies and you give them 10 categories of the federal budget and you say, where would you like to spend this? And if you do it in all 16 counties, outside polling places all over Maine, you get pretty much the same result. They put most of the pennies in the health. It used to be education, healthcare, the VA. Nowadays, it would probably be healthcare, education, the VA. And they put very few pennies into the Pentagon. And then when you take those results and graph them and put them right next to what the actual federal budget is, it's a mirror image. You know, the Pentagon is like this and education and healthcare are down here. So.
Just another useful function of ranked choice voting. All right. And I'm waiting for our next question is from Michael Zubas. To anyone, what would be the best way to have an eco-friendly military outside of not having one at all?
I mean, military machines are designed to extinguish all systems of life, including human life, but they extinguish social life, economic life. I mean, they're instruments of death. They're not life nurturing or life giving. So that's kind of oxymoronic to talk about a green military. I remember I went into Kuwait with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and some British officers came over and they'd all gone to Sandhurst, and the officers in 1st Battalion had all came out of the South and were not polished English. And I remember the colonel, as soon as they left, kind of breaking apart his M16 and cleaning it in a fit of pique, saying what those people forget is that we're killers. I mean, the fact is the nature of a military machine, once you strip away all the euphemisms, you know, rules of engagement. What's engagement? Engagement is killing. And I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We knew that if the Serbs broke through the trench lines around the city, they would slaughter a third of the city population and drive the rest into refugee and displacement camps. That wasn't conjecture. We saw that in what they had done in the Vukovar Valley and Mostar and all sorts of other places. So, you know, but once you pick up, once you use military means, once you use violence, even in that case, the defense of your life, you're not saved from the poison of violence. So, you know, I think part of it is recognizing what, you know, a military is about and what it does, both in terms of its social impact and its cultural impact, and you know, what it's created for. It's an instrument of death. That's what it does. That's what and it's designed to deliver death to those who are fighting in the most efficient way possible. So talking about a green military is kind of like talking about a military that is not going to carry out its primary function, which is murder.
Thank you, Chris. Would anyone else like to comment? Oh, Lisa, you look like you're ready.
Yeah, I was going to say too that we talked about the climate impact of the military quite a bit, but we did not talk about a lot of the other pollution that that results from military bases. It's not climate harm exactly, but there's a lot of groundwater contamination around military bases. There are often very high cancer rates, even among the military personnel themselves or the surrounding community. We've seen the US pressure South Korea into entombing a heritage soft coral beautiful reef to build a deep water port for our warships. That's another kind of environmental harm that militaries do. So there's certainly many areas that could be improved or addressed in terms of less toxic presence. I read an article about 6 months ago in a Canadian publication where the Canadian military, a much less offensive focused force than ours, they do contribute to wars, but not certainly with the vigor that the United States does. We're responding more and more to assisting people who were experiencing flooding or wildfires or other effects of climate change. And the military commander in Canada that was talking to the journalist was saying, you know, we're having to retrain because that isn't really what we learned in basic training, and that's not what our troops are prepared for, but that's what they're being sent out to do. So we're really having to shift our focus to that kind of emergency relief for people that are experiencing extremes from climate change.
I'd like to just kind of pick up on that point. That's really what the Natural Guard, Lisa, you started the Maine Natural Guard, and that's really the kind of the vision of it is, you know, because of climate change, we're going to have all these weather events, increasingly severe weather events. And we're going to need to go in and do rescue, recovery, reconstruction at these places. And we're going to need money, and we're going to need trained, as you were saying, trained forces to do that. And so again, part of the conversion idea for me is let's change the military to the Natural Guard, where that we're out doing actually something good. And I think that most people in the military, they want to do something, you know, for their country. You know, patriotism isn't necessarily a bad idea. It's a matter of how it's used, you know. If it's used to benefit humanity, to benefit taking care of the environment, it can be a positive feeling, you know. And so I think if we were to really collectively in all of our movements make this idea of converting to a Natural Guard from the Pentagon, where we do this kind of rescue, recovery, reconstruction work, because it's going to be a big problem. There's going to be refugee situations like we can't imagine. And right now, the Pentagon, the documents that we've seen, they're talking about just militarizing those operations to deal with refugees after climate events. So we've got to begin to really, I think, highlighting this different vision for the future.
Yeah, I'd just like to add too that Bruce touched on conversion a couple of times, but we saw an example of how quickly a weapons manufacturing facility, Bath Iron Works, builds warships for the Navy only. That's their only contractor. But in the pandemic, the Defense Production Act that allows the federal government to kind of ask private industry to build something that's needed for the public good, contacted Bath Iron Works and said, you know, there are only 2 facilities making these nasal swabs for COVID-19 testing, and one of them is in Guilford, Maine. And we've contacted them to say, could you double production? And they said, well, yes, if we got more space, and we would need the machines. Could you, Bath Iron Works, make those machines for us? If we, hey, we've got this great federal contract sitting right here, ready to go. Well, of course, Bath Iron Works said sure, and they, kind of turned on a dime and began producing these machines that make the swabs, and they delivered them to the facility in Guilford. We're always being told, oh no, Bath Iron Works could only build warships because jobs and because we can't just convert. Well, actually, with federal funding, they could convert pretty quickly. And as someone, I think Bruce alluded to earlier, building weapons isn't actually a very good jobs program in terms of how many jobs it generates. Economist research has shown again and again, they'll like build a model of how many jobs you get by investing $1 billion in, the defense industries or education, health, or, clean energy systems. And if Bath Iron Works were suddenly building solar panels or a light rail system, it would actually generate about 50% additional jobs. And these are full, good, union jobs with benefits. So conversion isn't impossible. We're just led to believe that it can't happen, but it really could happen rather quickly.
Thanks. Thank you all for responding. Our next question was submitted anonymously and says, what can we do as individuals to reduce the costs of war? How do we pass legislation in America where neither major party is interested in defunding the military? And that's directed towards anyone that would like to respond.
I'll go first. Well, you're going to have to stop electing people who take money from those very corporations. And one of the things that is unique about my candidacy is that I've pledged to neither solicit nor accept corporate lobbyist donations, corporate executive donations, or the super PACs that launder that corporate money so candidates can take it and claim they're not taking. As long as Congress doesn't represent the people, but represents for-profit corporations, we're probably not going to be able to fix this problem. When earlier on, someone had the question, how can we stop nuclear war? Well, I'm pretty sure most people in this country don't want nuclear war, and I'm pretty sure most Russian people and most Chinese people don't want nuclear war. So if the people that are going to represent our government would represent the people instead of corporations that make money off building nuclear weapons, we might get somewhere with this problem.
Go ahead, Chris. You want to say anything about that?
I mean, we're in a peculiar position because we're an empire, and empires are by their nature expansive. Empires are also particularly fragile because they're not self-sustaining. They depend on the empire to sustain themselves. So when the empire collapses, the blowback internally is quite significant. I mean, I would say, the empire is unraveling. And to the extent that we can retreat and consolidate and shrink responsibly, the safer we'll be and the safer that the planet will be. I look at the military as a kind of necessary evil. It's great the National Guard helps flood victims, but that has nothing to do with training young men and women to kill. Which is, if you're a combat soldier or a Marine, is operant conditioning. The same way we train a dog, you constantly, replicate the systems of a combat situation and then train people to react instinctively, because in a combat situation, you can't, and I've been in many, you can't ask questions. So that's how people get killed, but it's a matter of seconds. So, I think the big question is empire. How are we going to allow empire simply to implode with all of the negative consequences that has? I would argue that, Trump is not the disease. He's the symptom of a decayed society. But in the end, that blunt instrument of the military, as I said before, is vicious, and it's meant to be. And I don't know that, if we look at history, what I think historians have counted like 9 years in all of human history that we haven't been at war. So, I do take that kind of dark view of human nature. I do think a military is necessary, but I think in our case, Canada is a good example. It is not an offensive. Most countries, I lived in Switzerland, hasn't fought a war in 500 years, but everybody does military service. It was the one country the Nazis didn't invade. As Hitler said, he could take it, but it wasn't worth the cost. So it is about the dismantling of empire and the reconfiguration of military into a defensive force. But again, that, I look at that military culture as toxic, hyper-masculine, that warrior culture. It does damage to individuals and damage to the society, and I think that has to be understood. It can't be romanticized, and it has to be contained as much as possible.
I would like to kind of wrap up with this thought. For years, the Pentagon and the aerospace industry has been saying that Star Wars, War in the Heavens, would be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. And so a couple of years back, some years back, Space News, one of the industry publications, said that they needed to identify a dedicated funding source to pay for all of their space plans. And they said in an editorial, we have, and we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure that funding source. And they called it the entitlement programs that officially are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the tattered social safety net. So I think the way we stop all of this is fight for social progress, fight for our beautiful green Mother Earth that these corporations are destroying. They're wanting to now move civilization off to Mars and other planetary bodies. Elon Musk wants to terraform Mars. You know what terraform means? Make Mars green like the Earth. Can you imagine how much money that would cost? It's insane. So if we fight for this planet and we fight for each other so that we can have a decent life and the next 7 generations can live as well, then I think we can stop this military madness. But it has to be active. It has to be aggressive. Nonviolent movement. We must be in the streets where we link these issues more and more all the time. I just want to thank Lisa for running, and I want to thank Tamara for the great facilitation, and thank Chris for being a part of this too, and thank everybody for being on this call. And thank you for inviting me as well.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And Chris, would you like to make a final statement, and then Lisa can close us out?
No, I haven't voted for a Democrat since before 2000. The least worst voting doesn't work. I think there's plenty of historical evidence that says that we have to begin to take a stand on many issues, including the climate, which is the greatest existential threat to human life, not just human life, but most life on the planet. And remember that, politics is a small part of that stand. So, mass civil disobedience, as many young people are doing in the streets across the cities. I was at Standing Rock as part of Occupy, and we don't have any time left. So we have to make that courageous step to turn our backs on the system and build another system, which is why I'm a supporter of Lisa's candidacy in the Green Party.
Thank you, Chris, for your endorsement. I'm very honored to be endorsed by many of the thinkers and activists that I admire. And Chris Hedges was one of the people on the list. I think Bruce reached out to him to ask if he'd endorse my candidacy for the US Senate. I have to admit that I have not run for many elected offices. I was an elected union negotiator, but I've tried many different approaches to helping people understand that our need to come together is the greatest need of all. Most of us do value humans and other forms of life, and we want to take care of each other. That is a very natural human impulse. And when we come together, it's almost unbelievable what can be accomplished. And pretty much anything that ever has been accomplished through the cooperation of like-minded people has always been naysayed, and people have said, oh, that's impossible, can't be done, can't happen. And that's part of the process. So because of ranked choice voting, I took a chance on running for the US Senate here in Maine. I love Maine. I was born in Maine. I went to college in Maine. I have very deep Maine roots. And I do think it's possible to elect an independent Green senator of Maine. And I look forward to exploring the power of one senator in the US Senate. I have a feeling there will be a wave of progressive candidates being elected to Congress this election, but it's worth trying. And I know that under ranked choice voting, we have a shot at it. So I really appreciate everyone who came tonight. If you agreed with us, that's great. If you didn't agree with us, that's great too. I loved your questions. Thank you so much for listening to us. And thank you, Chris Hedges, and thank you, Bruce Gagnon, for being here with us and sharing your thoughts. Thank you, Tamara Hunt, for being such a great moderator. You did a wonderful job. And the people behind the scenes, Kelly Merrill, made this technology work beautifully, and Dave Schwab is there to help us live stream to YouTube and Facebook. And Chris Kerr, our campaign manager, is generally there to support us all in what we're doing. We have another webinar coming up on Tuesday. It's going to be, it's titled Racial Justice at Home and Abroad. We have Ajamu Baraka, who is leads the Black Alliance for Peace and was a vice presidential candidate on the Green Party ticket last time in 2016. And we have Joseph Jackson, who is director of the Maine Prison Advocacy group, to talk to us about decarceration and what that would mean for racial justice. And also Desiree Vargas, who's a trainer that our campaign team has worked with recently to work on decolonizing our thinking and addressing issues of racial equity. And she identifies as Taino, so indigenous from the Caribbean, and also of African descent. And she's going to be talking about the intersectionality of being a woman and being indigenous and being Black, and help us understand a little bit more about that experience. So right after this webinar, you will receive a letter from us with an email from us with a link to register for that webinar. It's going to be at the same time of day, 5 p.m. on next Tuesday. So I hope that you'll join us. And thanks so much for being here. Remember, you're not alone.
Get a shirt. Get a shirt. Good night.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Night, everybody. Great job. Thank you so much.